Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. As always, I'm your host, John Berry, and with me, as always, the Pippin to my Jordan, Jeremy Sporn. Hey, Jeremy. The Chicago folks are gonna appreciate that reference.
Yeah, I thought that all of our listeners were from Chicago, so I decided to throw them a bone. I finished The Last Dance not too long ago. I know I'm a little late to the party, but they're on my mind. I don't know what to tell you.
When I read that, I was just nervous that you were going to say that you had a headache and you needed to pull out of the rest of the intro. But
no. Oh, that's wow. It took a
we just lost all the Chicago Bulls fans. All right. What do you think of my conversation with Craig?
I'll be honest. I was really looking forward to this one. Internally at Pivot Point, the debate of GRC tool or no GRC tool looks more like a ancient mythical struggle than a modern debate. It's incredible, the opinions that are around that one issue. There are so many schools of thought, and I appreciated what Craig did in his approach, which was really to just talk about why he wanted to have a different kind of tool in the first place. And it was this idea of addressing business needs, and this idea that efficient management of building and maintaining and improving security and compliance is a business challenge, and he wanted to address that. So I just thought it was a really cool approach of his.
Agreed. And I learned a bit as well. As you probably know from those internal debates, is I'm generally not an advocate really of using what I'll call conventionally or a conventional GRC tool. What I think is a bit different here with HyperProof's approach is they're really focusing on a GRC tool from the backside, from the compliance side, from the proving you're secure side. So rather than from the build side, which is as you're using this tool to help you architect and document your information security management system. I think as we move towards continuous audit and as we move towards more complex frameworks to conform with things like the CMMC, I think that this particular approach changes the value proposition of a GRC tool a fair deal, and I think it makes it something that has a higher likelihood of returning a pretty fair value, relative to a conventional GRC tool.
Yeah, and it was actually cool. It felt like you were almost vetting Craig and his tool during the conversation a little bit, which was, if anyone is interested, if anyone needs to do that, there are a bunch of questions that I would have never thought to ask that you pushed on him. You're like, hey, well, I understand. Why don't you do this? I thought that was so cool. I was a big fan. So if you're out there listening and you have compliance standards you need to manage, this episode is for you. Craig does a great job of explaining the value of a GRC tool and when he thinks it's best for a company to invest in one and also not. It was not a sales pitch, even though he is clearly a giant fan of HyperProof, which I really appreciated. It felt like I was being coached on the key things I need to know to choose the right tool for myself. Craig did a great job. Really, really valuable stuff. Looking forward to everyone listening in.
Yeah, listen, I mean, obviously, if you listen to him chat, he's a bright guy. If you look at his background and all the work they did at Microsoft and some of the products that he was responsible for, including Microsoft Dynamics CRM, which we're actually a customer of, right? The guy's got a resume, and he's using that resume to build what looks like a pretty interesting product. That I do think that for certain people will have a very compelling value proposition. So I think if you're one of those people, especially, this is going to be a good show for you. So with no further delay, let's get to the show. Craig, good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, John. Happy to be here. How about you?
I am living the COVID life, baby. Living the COVID life. Let's start simple. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what is it that you do.
Yeah, I'm Craig Unger, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company out here in Bellevue, Washington, right on the outskirts of Seattle, called HyperProof. And our company is really all about changing the landscape in the compliance space, making it a lot easier to do that kind of activity. So we're a small company of 30 people, living, unfortunately, the COVID lifestyle now, but in our first year of being in business in terms of selling the product. It's a 2-year-old company, but we just shipped the product earlier in the year, at the very beginning of the year. So we're a new company.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have you here. And, it's fun for me because there is always this interesting debate, and with our customers, and customers ask all the time, hey, we're going to get ISO certified, 27001 certified, or we're going to get SOC 2 attested or CMMC. Do we need a tool, right? Generally speaking, these tools are often referred to as like a governance, risk, and compliance tool. So I'm going to ask you an interesting question. So, there are a lot of GRC tools in the marketplace. Yeah. So what made you a couple of years ago look at a marketplace that was already reasonably crowded and say, hey, I think I should start a GRC. I think I should bring a new tool to the market.
That's funny. Yeah, well, when I was looking at it, I was kind of picking on looking back to my experience doing it a couple of times. I did it once during my job at Microsoft. I had to do some compliance for the Windows Live ID product. And then I had a previous startup where I was also doing it as well. What I realized is it just wasn't a great application or tool for me. You're right, John, there are some tools, but they're a little bit antiquated, bigger, more expensive. Certainly nothing that's, cloud, multi-tenant with a really modern experience. And because of that, we didn't use a tool when I did it before. And I'm like, why wasn't it? So I was using email, I was using spreadsheets, I was putting files in Dropbox. And I thought, there's really room here for a tool.
Yeah, and that is, I think, a really, I think that's a good fundamental thing for us to kind of underpin the conversation on, right? Is where is it where there's a value proposition associated with the tool, right? So again, you went back and you looked at this and you said, hey, I got ISO certified without a tool, and you decided to come out with a tool. So what is it that you think people, what are the challenges that you're addressing, that you thought were important to address for people that are listening, like that might be thinking the same thing, hey, about to get ISO certified, should I invest in a tool or not?
Well, from an environment perspective, what we saw happening was compliance was kind of following the same path that security did, where it started out as a domain of a few people that would kind of, take a look at your security posture, generate a report, maybe they'd hire some white hat hackers, send it over to the board, and you're good for a year. That's the way compliance is still being treated largely, but we see it moving more towards like security where, it's continuous. People need to be trained on it. Everybody's a steward of it. And the process is democratized. So you got to get enough people involved because they're the people that have the evidence. So when you look at it in that lens, you're looking at it as a business process more than anything else that requires collaboration, automation, and a functional modern system of record. That didn't exist. When we talk about those other products, they were really kind of like for specialists.
So in a weird way, and for those listening, I know of HyperProof. We've looked at it a little bit. We're interested in the product ourselves and seeing how we might be able to use it or be able to explain to our clients how we might be able to use it. And you guys recently got, I believe it was SOC 2 attestation. That was one of the things that was a concern of ours. We wanted to make sure that you had that prior to having those more deeper conversations. So I'm actually exploring the conversation a little bit myself here today. So that's what you said is that kind of interesting. It sounds as if you're taking, like most of the early governance, risk, and compliance products, and we work with quite a few of them at points, they tended to be more about building the program from a forward-facing perspective. Now, it sounds to me the way you're addressing this is that from a compliance perspective, which is sort of the working backwards in the process. And in a weird way, it makes a lot of sense to me because, when we would always build, back in the old days, I used to do database development, and we used to, it was a programmer at one point. And, to me, you always begin with the end in mind. Like, if somebody said, what should the database look like? I would say, well, tell me the report I'm going to have to generate. Right? So start at the end and then work backwards to the beginning. In a weird way, is that what you guys are doing with this kind of taking that compliance-oriented approach?
I think it's an amazing observation. It's 100% true. So basically, and I'll put some words around it for you. What's been going on and really is the kind of standard right now in the industry is what we call inside the company occasional compliance. And what I mean by that is you get compliant when you need to for an audit, you pass the audit, and then you probably don't look at it again for another 6 or 8 months until you have to do the audit again. That's that forward-looking process that you're talking about. But now, if you go and you look at the people who are, let's say, working in security or in operations and IT or in the business, and you look at it from their perspective, well, there's lots of different groups doing audits. I'm getting hit up for a lot of evidence. I'm getting hit up for all the same stuff over and over and over again. How does a piece of software make my life simpler? And the way it does it, the way HyperProof does it, is it gives you agency to take it back and say, look, I'm going to create a program here that stands outside the audit that I can maintain all throughout the course of the year. When people come and ask me questions I'll just answer them with the evidence I already have. So it avoids all the audit fatigue and that concept of like, are you really asking me again? I just gave this 6 weeks ago. And if you throw some automation in the mix, it's even better, because not only can I answer real time, I can even automate the answer to that question. And so in a nutshell, we took it from the perspective of CISOs, people who work in that organization, rather than the auditor or the internal audit department or even the external auditor.
Gotcha. So in many organizations, the auditors are coming in, let's say you're doing SOC 2 and you've got a 1-year observation period. It's not uncommon those like 2 weeks beforehand, it's a all hands on deck, do we have everything we need? So it sounds as if to me, like what you're trying to do is automate the process so that it wouldn't matter when they walked in the door. Like the data is just going to be there because that's what happens.
Exactly right. You maintain your stance throughout the course of the year, and you can represent that, whether it be if you start from kind of inner working on out, it could be people in the security team that just want to come in. Maybe it's your manager wants to come in and check that some of these controls are working. So you can represent that and audit that. One level further than that is an internal auditor, and you can represent that and give your internal groups the confidence. And then of course the next level would be the external auditor, right? But the key is those activities could happen whenever,
right?
You're prepared.
Right. Yeah. Maybe because all of those are stakeholders, right? At the end of the day, that what we want to do is we want to provide assurance to stakeholders that we're doing what we said we were doing.
That's right.
So question for you. So I know that you guys stress, on your website, the concept of continuous compliance, right? So that's what you mean by continuous compliance?
It's exactly what I mean. So like if you look in the product, you'll see 2 different concepts. One's called a program, which would be like an ISO or a SOC or GDPR or custom. We'll do custom ones. And then one's an audit. The audit is much more temporal in nature. It comes, it goes, you prepare for it. The audit piece of the product that we have is much more about work management. It's kind of like you get a task, you got to provide the proof, who is it provided in time. The program part is much more about collecting the data for compliance. That's where you'll find your controls and your requirements. They're 2 different concepts. They come together and intersect at a point in time. But if you look at what's been done in the industry before, those concepts haven't been separated. It's mostly been audit preparation types of software.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or program build types of software. Like, so a lot of times, like when we're looking at it, like, so we're a consulting firm that often is coming at the very onset of a program. And, like from a GRC perspective, a lot of times we're looking at something which is more geared towards helping us consistently build a program, right? Taking through the logical scoping process, making sure we're generating the right artifacts, getting the data flow diagrams, making sure the document management, policy management components of, right? More, I think that's, to me, that's more conventional GRC. So so you've got this continuous audit backside of it. Do you have that more conventional GRC, policy management, incident response? A lot of times they're throwing in third-party risk management, all that kind of stuff on the front side, or are you guys really staying true to that, continuous compliance, continuous audit kind of mantra?
Oh no, in fact, if anything, we're more focused on the front part, on the program side. So we have, we ship with all the frameworks. We got 40 plus frameworks. We ship with sample controls. We allow you to create collaborations of the people that are going to need to track it over time. We allow you to create automation. And then importantly, we give you visibility through health. So you can actually set a policy that says, here's how frequently you need evidence updated, things like that, so that you always have visibility. And we're heavily invested in the analytics and the visibility for compliance. So we're very, very focused on the program and bringing that together. A lot of times, John, the process you're talking about occurs through spreadsheets, right? Mm-hmm. And through documents that are sent in email. So in a way, we wanted to automate and make that process smoother.
Right. Gotcha. And quick question for you. So if I have a perfectly architected, a perfectly architected control environment means that I've basically perfectly matched my risk treatments to my risks, my controls to my risks, and that if I'm executing those controls per their definition, that I'm at zero, I'm at acceptable risk.
That's right.
So if you are doing continuous compliance, does that imply I'm doing continuous security and maintaining a continuous security posture? And if so, why aren't you promoting that? Which sounds like a pretty cool thing to promote.
That's a really interesting point. We've talked about it.
Really?
It's definitely the case. It's 100% the case, because compliance is just the flip side of security. It's proving that you're secure. So anytime you can automate, your compliance. By nature of doing that, you're also automating some level of your security. Now in the market, there are some other vendors that specialize on automating security. They don't go as far as the compliance piece, but the short answer is over time, we are going to talk about it more.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're not automating security, but if you're perfectly executing the control environment, the control environment is perfectly matched to manage risk, then what you're doing is you're continuously validating that their security posture is where they want it to be, right? Because compliance equals security at that point in time. So that's a good question. So from your perspective, what would you see as being like sort of, I'll call it the intersection between security and compliance?
Well, I mean, I think in our approach, if you look at our approach, a lot of it has to do with the evidence collection. If you look at what the corpus of where the capability is that people look at and go, wow, HyperProof is pretty special. It's in the case of how we, or in our approach to how we collect evidence, and then what is a pretty complex set of mappings that get reused across different programs. So there's even been partners and customers as well who have wanted to just really focus down on the evidence collection piece, because maybe they're not doing a standard program. Most of our customers use, they're doing ISO, they're doing GDPR, they're doing something standard. But maybe a customer is doing something special for themselves based on the industry they're in, but they like the fact that they can collaborate both through human workflows and automated workflows and get in that evidence. So I think that's where we play in that. And certainly you would say to some degree, the analytics and reporting out of the fact that you are, in compliance. That's really where we're at. Versus like, we don't do scans and we don't, we're not trying to do intrusion detection. We'll integrate with those kinds of vendors.
Gotcha. So let's go there. And so now I have like 3 questions that I think are all interrelated. So I don't know how I want to ask them. So, I was going to ask you about when should I, so I'm listening to this and should I be using a GRC tool? And I'm sure that the answer is in it depends. And I think some of the things are going to be number of standards that you're complying with, which types of standards, how many audits you're subject to, things of that nature. So let's kind of like flesh that in. So we're ISO 27001 certified as an organization. We're not yet on a tool like yours, right? There's a company that's just doing 27001. Is there enough value add to make that worthwhile? Or do I have to get to a point where I want to layer another SOC 2 or it's a Center for Internet Security controls on? Like, where do we get to the point? Like, how does a company know if they're going to get the return on implementing HyperProof?
Yeah, I think we see 2 different scenarios there that we've identified. One is actually for smaller organizations, which are needing a little bit more in the way of prescriptive help. Because what we do is we have all the standards in there. We work, with the compliance, the standard bodies, and we keep it up to date out of our product management team. So like there's some insurance part to, the fact that we've always got the latest requirements for you, and we ship with our own illustrative control. So effectively, we're giving you some guidance to use there. And I would also add, we ship with a methodology, because a lot of times when you're first getting compliant, like, how do I even get started? Well, we have a methodology around how you bring your program from conception into reality. And so that whole set of interlinked capability, super helpful for an organization getting started. And in fact, I'll just say, that's the stuff we shipped with when we first shipped. The stuff we've been doing since that time, and we've been really busy over the last 9 months, has much more geared to the latter part of your question, John, around I've got multiple programs. I have to crosswalk those together so that I could leverage the proof, the people, and the controls that I've already put in place. Because what I don't want to do is start setting up new controls every time I have to do a new audit. That is kind of backwards. So scaling out your compliance program, sometimes we call it the compliance journey. That's another great usage of HyperProof. So we find both cases.
Gotcha. And so if we get to that backside, right? So let's make this more tangible for folks, right? So let's say that I'm ISO 27001 certified or SOC 2, and I'm using your tool. Like, what's going into your tool and how's it getting in there, right? So you talk about integrations and you talk about automation. You've used both those terms. So I'm assuming those integrations and automation are going to be part of the way that we're going to get this evidence into the system. So can we talk about that? Like, and get down to like hey, user account management reviews, or, incident response, or firewall rule-based reviews, or whatever it is. So like, we're really talking more in more concrete terms.
Yeah, so there's 2 kinds of integrations that we're doing right now. The first is the one that we started with, which is a set of, you would call it almost document-based integrations to document stores. So Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, SharePoint. A lot of evidence is already collected in SharePoint. What we want to do is make it so that if a large body of people in your organization already have a process that they're following to drop in that evidence, it's really easy to bring it into HyperProof. So those are out-of-box types of integrations. Another class of out-of-box integrations we have are with communication tools. So you can actually take the conversation that you're having inside HyperProof, because we have collaboration in the product, but you can export that over to Slack and have that conversation in Slack. That's in the product now. We're adding Microsoft Teams. So there's those kind of integrations. And then what's more recent than that is there's a general purpose integration framework that we have with the product that will allow you to touch any source. So you want to get user logs out of AWS or Azure, or you want to get some security scans out of Qualys or whatever you want. Those ones are ones that you can actually author. And here's the key. You can author those integrations into HyperProof already. You've been able to do it for the last year by doing it in your own environment, right? You can write some Java or JavaScript or whatever it is, because we have APIs. The thing that's new that we're bringing imminently, it's coming in the next 8 weeks or so, is the ability for us to run those integrations instead of you. So we'll give you a little code window and we'll say, hey, what data do you want to pull out of Qualys? Let's say, okay, where do you want it to go? Do you want it to go into this set of controls? We have a concept in the product called labels that you can use as a store for your evidence, and then you can attach labels to multiple controls. So there's a lot of ways to do it, and we will let you customize that integration, and we will operate it for you. And that's the benefit of the new capability that we're bringing.
What do you mean by so I have this automation? Let's say let's say we're using Nessus, and let's say I've got and this is what we do. We have a requirement in our ISMS that we scan our end consultant laptops and once every 30 days. Okay. So how would that integration work? So I need to scan those laptops. I need to make sure that we say that if we have vulnerabilities of a certain type, above a certain CVSS level, that those are going to need to be addressed. The process is IT reaches out to the consultants. Sometimes those laptops are not visible to them. They've got to make them visible. They've got to make the change, and then we have to close that loop. So would your product provide value prop there? And if so, kind of take me through what that would look like.
Yeah, so basically what you would do is, you would figure out that body of evidence needs to get mapped to a certain set of controls that HyperProof has managed. So what you would do in our automation environment is you're basically tackling the RESTful API that provider has. So basically we would call the API, effectively do a search and search and get those information and those logs, and then we would bring it in. Now that part happens automatically. Once it comes in, then you get to use the rest of the infrastructure inside HyperProof. And what I mean by that is we have health calculations. So you can start to calculate health of this control on the basis of evidence that you brought in. You can get people to review it. So we're right now, you can mention people and say, hey, I'd say mention you, John, and I'd say, hey, John, can you take a look at this? We're very close to the ability to peg a date on that and actually make it a formal task. Right now it's mentioned and you get a notification. We've just shipped in the last release the ability to start creating these tasks, which would put some teeth into that and say, hey, John, you got to really get back to me in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And on that basis, I'll decide whether we're good or not on this control. And on that basis, the dashboard will get updated so that I know and my management knows that the compliance program is actually moving forward.
Gotcha. Does that include some kind of workflow capability? So, as an example, if I needed to report that I had closed that, and then somebody else needed to sign off on the way I closed it, the way I hit that, or we had user account management reviews or something of that nature. Same idea.
Same idea. We're doing that through a concept called tasks. You would assign tasks to people and say, can you please approve it as part of this task? And then they would do that in it. And then you might not update the health until they approve it, to the final approval.
Gotcha. So we talked about it. So just to be clear, we talked about integrations at that point, correct? Does that, how did the integrations interact with the automations?
Well, the way we think about it is that the automations are the things that happen kind of automatically while you sleep. So we have a concept in the product called Live Sync. And basically what happens is after you set up one of these integrations, meaning let's say it's integration into SharePoint where you're dropping a bunch of evidence in. There's literally a button that it's a slider, but you just hit the slider and then you turn Live Sync on. And then from then on in, HyperProof keeps track of all that proof for you. So you've taken an integration that we have with another system and you've turned it into an automation with this Live Sync capability. Again, we also have the ability to do it for custom sources that we don't yet have in as integrations, as long as I said before, as long as they have RESTful APIs, we can do it that
Gotcha.
way.
So another example, I can imagine another use case that would be like integrated into like a help desk system. I could see where there'd be, that would be a common, like, because a lot of people use help desk to like trigger like workflows around employee onboarding and employee offboarding.
I was going to say,
Right.
human resource management for onboarding, offboarding is a big one. We've used spreadsheets for that in the past, and we want to move off and just have things automatically happen. Like, for instance, one of the integrations we're writing would be an integration to something like Checker, where if anybody's going to have production access, they have to have a background check. Well, let's grab that out of Checker and let's put it in the control of who I'm not going to get production access.
Right. So you can integrate into an HRIS. You could go into an applicant tracking system if I had certain validations that take place during. Gotcha. Same thing with we use a learning management system, online learning management system.
That's right. Training. Right.
So from a training perspective, that can be scripted. I'm assuming you have like some kind of email parser, because that can be scripted to send, like, we get an email message once a week with an Excel file attached to it. So I'm guessing I could, through your API, I could parse an Excel file and make it based on
outside of, it's not through the API, but what we would do is hopefully the learning system or the training system in its own storage system would store whether you watched it, and then through our API you can get out the criteria that you watched it and bring that in.
I gotcha. Cool. So we talked about integrations, automations, and that ties into, obviously, the more onerous and more significant the number of these activities that need to occur, right, the more value that integration, that automation brings. Where do you see the value prop? Like, if you look at your client base right now, who's coming to you and why? What is it that they need to conform with? Is it multiple standards? Is it a particular onerous standard? What's a typical use case and why?
Well, through the year, it's been changing a little bit, and now with some of the capabilities we've added recently, John, it is starting to get more towards medium to large size enterprises who have a pretty limited set of folks they can deploy towards these problems, but the workload's just getting bigger and bigger. And I mean, you can denominate it by these companies were doing 3 or 4 programs, perhaps, frameworks a few years ago. Some of our customers are now stretching up close to 20 compliance programs that they have to do.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
Yeah, it's and so they want to get reuse. They can't have these run as 20 independent processes from a scheduling perspective, visibility perspective, and some companies that aren't necessarily in touch with that kind of idea of reusing your evidence. They don't even have access to it today to be able to reuse it. So they're coming to us and they're like, okay, how do I scale it? How do I actually do this crosswalking? A really interesting capability in the product we call Jumpstart. And what Jumpstart does is it takes a look at all the compliance programs you're already doing in your instance. And then it looks at our library and it says, here's how much of these new ones you've already got done. Mm-hmm. And the way we do it is we just match the requirements up and we say, look, you already have a control for that. Mm-hmm. So so boom, you've got that done. And so, those kinds of capabilities are what these enterprises want, because they want to be able to scale. Basically, on their side and on the auditor side, both, it's been such a manual and expensive process that anything they can do to, control the headcount growth, but also get better visibility and mitigate risk, if they can do it all at the same time, they're really interested. So it's about scaling.
Yeah, but I would imagine that, in a weird way, like organization, like the SOC 2 auditors would love working with your clients, because it would make their job easier and less expensive. Right, because if you think about it, they don't have to go in there and ask for all the evidence, and year over year, especially year 2, year 3, they know exactly where it is, how to get to it, and it, they're not chasing people around for evidence. The evidence is always in the same place every time.
We've gotten a few referrals from folks like that. They're CPA firms and others that issue opinions that haven't heard of us necessarily. Then they get into their client and they're like, I could do the audit this way. And then all of a sudden we hear from them. I'll tell you a quick story. Of course, we use HyperProof to do our own audits. And I was doing, as the administrator of the company, the CEO, I have a bunch of controls that I have to deal with, right? And so with HyperProof, I was able to get, I had about 30 some odd controls on my SOC 2. And I was able to put in all of my evidence in 1 hour and 10 minutes. I finished my part of the SOC. My engineering team had to do more than that. But my part, I finished in 1 hour and 10 minutes. And the auditor had every Friday at 10 a.m. sync up. The first one was really interesting. And after that, they just stopped being interesting because I didn't have a whole lot left to do. So I think that surprises people. But I will also say one other thing. We are a very partner-focused company. We want to make the CPA firms extremely successful. There's a number of organizations out there that are talking about, hey, we're going to use AI and ML. We're going to automate away the human being out of this process. It may be what perhaps a CISO, might be interested in lowering the cost there. So I get why they're saying that. But the reality is that's not where we're at today. We need to have a strong ecosystem of folks who are out there and really making sure that we all keep our promises. And I think HyperProof is very, very tuned and we have about 30 partners now that are working with us in that vein. So it's about making it easier, but it's about making it easier so that you as a partner of ours, your CPA firm, where you could be doing advisory work, so that you can actually get to a higher level of business value with your client. We're not looking to put anybody out of work.
Yeah, it's really funny you say that because we've made great efforts over the last couple of years to automate a lot of things. We've accelerated risk management through some really cool things that we've done. We've automated some document generation, for very common oriented artifacts that it's not just, fill in the blanks in a template, right? It's contextualized and it does some really intelligent and cool things based on the organization, based on the results of the interviews and the artifacts and the things that we've gathered. And people are always like, aren't you worried no, what that really does is it frees up the consultants to consult. Right, because I mean, if a consultant's sitting there and wordsmithing documents and making those changes manually, and we're charging a client X $1,000 per day for a guy, and they're using that time to generate documents, they can only afford to pay 50 grand, and 50 grand was doing the menial stuff. We never got to the real value prop, which is the actual consultative guidance, right? It's the sitting there and really, right. So really you're kind of trying to do the same thing that we're doing, right? Is, when we're automating that back end, the idea isn't to replace people. The idea is to let people do what people do best, which is to think, and objectively assess evidence and determine whether or not we're doing things in an optimal way. So that way, A, we're truly compliant, and B, we're truly secure. Right?
Exactly. Now, I've talked to a number of CPA firms where they say, you know what, I hired these brilliant people in college, and after a year, I'm facing attrition because they're tired of copying and pasting a piece of evidence and doing all this over and over and over again. And not only that, the way it works today, John, is that they're on a schedule, right? You know how it is with a SOC audit. They send some people over pre-COVID for 3-4 days, and they jump into your facility, they interview you and things like that. And I think it's a good segue at this point to continuous audit, right? Because our whole thought on it is that if a CISO in his organization internally can get to a state of continuous compliance, it at least opens up the possibility for the audit firm to do continuous audit. And that's a benefit because their scheduling is really tough right now. And the biggest problem they have is that they go spend the 4 days, and then it turns out the client was prepared. So they still have to ship those other people off to other work, but then they have to work overtime and come back to finish that audit. So we also think over time that that CPAs can move to this continuous audit model. And but the thing is we also feel that continuous compliance is a prerequisite, because how can I, as an auditor, talk to my client, every couple of weeks and see what's new if I don't have a structured system to do it? So that's how we see things changing,
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. Because we aspire to, so organizations that we work with, where we've gotten them certified to whatever framework it is, and most frameworks have some concept of internal audit each year, and we all know and want to aspire to quarterly audits, monthly audits, and the reality is that the organizations can't support that. Right, because they just don't have the time and bandwidth. So what you end up with is having some level of exposure where something changed. Context changes. Change equals risk. Change breaks processes. And now what happens is you don't become aware of that for you have technically an 11.5-month exposure window. Right. If I can sample logically, I've reduced your risk logically of a compliance gap by 75%. So really, I guess that's part of the value prop of what you're trying to get to, is that you're shortening those windows by making that capability available to them.
Yeah, and you defined what we call the state of the world today, which we are not satisfied with, which is occasional compliance. You get compliant, and then your risk goes up through the course of the year. In HyperProof, our auditors, they have a role inside our system. They don't get to see everything, right? There's internal conversations. There's effectively the program that we're running isn't really in their purview. But when it comes to the audit, which is like a separate entity inside HyperProof, they have access to that. So if I want to make something available to them 6 months before my audit, my next SOC audit, instead of 6 days, I can do that. I can drop it into the control, and my auditor sees it.
Gotcha. And I would assume, so you've got these programs. I'm running these programs. These programs have commonality across them. You're making that easier for people to deal with that. Then I'm assuming that if I was going to run an internal audit, that would be you would spin up the internal audit, which and then I'm assuming that if you were then having your external audit done, you'd spin that up as a separate assessment as well. That's and then you give the internal auditors just the access to that piece which is necessary to conduct the internal audit, and the same thing with the external auditors, although that access is probably going to look pretty similar because they're both going to be looking at the evidence and artifacts and documentation.
That's exactly how it works. What usually happens is we start with the DRL, document request list. That can be a little different between the internal and the external auditor. Usually comes in as a spreadsheet, but you bring that in, you do that once, and then all the rest of the work happens in HyperProof, where you attach evidence, you link back to controls and all the communication, and there's a full audit trail that all happens inside HyperProof. And our model for how we commercialize our software is that we charge by the program. So if you're doing SOC and doing ISO, that's 2 programs. You can generate as many assessments, audits, internal, external. We don't charge for them. It's, we don't care. We want you to do that, right?
Right.
We want usage.
Interesting. So, you guys consider yourself disruptors to the industry? Where does HyperProof and where does the industry go from here? Who's gonna? I'm assuming you're gonna tell me you're gonna be one of the winners. Who are not gonna be the winners as well?
Well, I mean, we're very focused on the disruption that comes around with continuous compliance, and then we sometimes generalize that concept to compliance operation. So we're creating really a platform that allows you to really operate your entire, compliance activity inside a company. GRC historically has been broader. There's elements of governance in there. There's some overlap there and risk for sure, but it's been a kind of boil the ocean exercise, I think, for too long. So you're trying to do a very wide range of capability for a very limited number of people. I think the thing that we're trying to disrupt and where we think the industry is going is that, you can't really reduce the risk profile of the organization unless you get the best of what everybody has to offer. And the only way you're going to get the best of what they have to offer is if you give them systems that they're actually interested in using, that are simple to use, that work the way that they work. And so I think, when I used to be at Microsoft, and I used to be the general manager for Dynamics CRM. And it was very similar. When I started back in CRM in 2006, it was really just sales teams, core sales teams and marketing teams that were using these CRM systems like a Siebel and an SAP. But by the time Salesforce and Dynamics CRM came out, if you just look at the percentage of people inside an organization that have access in some way to a CRM system, it's much, much, much greater now. That's exactly the way compliance is going. 5 years, we'll all have, different levels of access. We'll spend different amounts of time in there. We understand that compliance isn't what people are trying to do every day, but it's a very important thing. It's not necessarily the focus of their job for a whole large set of people. For some others it is, but everybody needs access to that tooling. And so generally, it's kind of interesting. If you look at the tech industry, software and SaaS industry generally, there's a move to take a lot of these general purpose concepts like collaboration, integration, and specialize them. So, it used to be you had generalized integration vendors. Now you see integration for DevOps and integration for, financial for auditors, and, all these different kind of specializations happening. And I think that's going to happen on collaboration too. You need a special set of tools to collaborate for this specific use case. So that's the disruption, is really bringing the usage model and the user model into kind of the 21st century and allowing us to unlock what needs to get unlocked inside your organizations. I think we're leading that charge right now, and people appreciate it. CISOs appreciate it. The people on the front lines appreciate it. And I think slowly, a wave is coming out where partners, organizations like your own, but also the ones that issue opinions like the CPA firms, realize that they have to be on top of this change and they have to kind of help guide it.
Gotcha. Does the how does the size, like, so if somebody's listening to this and going, this sounds kind of cool, but yeah, I don't know if we're big enough for a tool like this. I mean, so it's like when you think of the attributes that someone would use to determine whether or not a product of this nature makes sense, would that be size? We talked about it being the levels of integration. We talked about it being the number of programs. Does that directly correlate with size? I mean, do you see you have, you mentioned that you're working with some large organizations. Do what's a small organization that you look like that you work with?
Well, like a good example. Well, like if you go to our site, you'll see like 3 boxes up on our site. They do they're a tech company, SaaS, or in the education space. They're not a giant company. I know, I'm not quite sure how many employees they have, but it's a pretty small number overall. I mean, not as small as us. We're only 30. But we have other organizations our size in there, and then we have.
So really, literally, you'll literally have an organization that's 30 people using your platform?
Absolutely. We have organizations that size, literally that size, when they're just getting going. And then we have POCs that we're doing with companies that have more than 200,000 employees. So those we weren't doing 9 months ago. We're just stepping into that size. We are spanning, and I'll be candid. One of the biggest things we're going to home in on over the next year is where is the best place to focus our time, because there are opportunities in both these areas, and we've got to learn more about where we're best suited. In all honesty, we're off to great guns, and it's been a nice start, but we've really been selling the product for 10 months. So now we've got to really learn is the watchword. Gotcha.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny, like everyone likes to go up market. Having been both, I really like working in the SME space. The reason I do is that the people, they recognize your value, and that's where you truly partner with customers. And one of the problems with the big guys is they tend to treat you like, I hate to say this, but they tend to treat you like crap. They treat you like a number. You're something in a spreadsheet to them at some point somewhere up the line. Where you're working with a company that's 30 people, 100 people, 300 people, there's still some level of more, I don't know, personalization. So I love the SME space, and I'll never go back to servicing corporate America is definitely not for me.
I mean, I agree. Like, so we have another they're a fairly small company called Glance Networks, and they're a great tech company that does a lot in the way of collaboration software. After using our product, the CEO, Tom Martin, great guy, he got wind of it and he got in touch. And all of a sudden, he and I are talking about what we can do together. And you're not going to have those kinds of conversations with people like that in these larger companies. But the fact that in the small company, you can actually light up their productivity, and people who actually care about productivity get to see it, is actually a huge, huge thing. And it adds a lot of satisfaction to the job. I think that's what you're getting on. A lot of satisfaction.
Absolutely. And that what you did that day for them mattered. Like when you're dealing, like, and don't get me wrong, we have some really large companies, and sometimes you're working with a smaller group within a bigger company, and you still have that same value proposition. But I mean, it's hard to move the ball forward at Microsoft. I mean, in any given day, what you did, is it really going to influence versus, you're talking with a 50-person company. I mean, you can really do something in a single day that's significant.
Things, right? Yeah. Because if the senior leadership of Microsoft or those size companies knows about you, it's typically something it may not be a good thing.
That's exactly right. You don't want to be on their radar.
Exactly. Let's stay on that radar.
Question for you. Well, one last question I forgot to ask you. So we talked about security. When you talk about these programs, are you doing a lot with privacy? I mean, GDPR, CCPA, ISO 27701, those kind of things covered by your tool?
Yeah, we got them all. We've got all the ones you mentioned, ISO 27701. We have, of course, GDPR, CCPA. We have FIPA, which is Florida privacy, and we're adding more as we go. So cool. It's important.
Yeah, I think that's going to be it kind of, I think, waylaid a little bit this year, because I think, with our friend COVID, I think people have said, like, I don't have time to deal with privacy. But I think with the DPAs coming out, the data privacy addendums, and you're going to see a lot more privacy and third-party risk management questionnaires. I think you're going to see a big bounce there this year. And I think that's going to be I think that gets interesting too. There's really some great opportunities there as well for you to automate some of the compliance there, because some of that stuff is a little bit hard to deal with. With accessing DSARs and the processes necessary to provide that evidence and delete
That's right.
personal information. So yeah, there's probably some really cool opportunities there for continuous compliance, and that's one of those ones that could get people in a lot of trouble.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of the security ones end up being a case where you're automating the system.
Yes.
Whereas like in the case of privacy, you really are getting down to that user level, right? Getting everything. Did they opt in? Did they not opt in? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And with your connectors, you could take it from the very front end of the process, where you have to have the capability on the website for somebody to make an access request, and tracking that, that comes right in, right through the system, and somebody can say, hey, prove that this happened, show me down to the record level.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, that's a pretty cool use case. All right. Anything we didn't touch on yet that you think we should probably touch on with regards to HyperProof and how an organization can determine whether or not product? Can I ask you a question you don't want to answer? I know this is one of those huge it depends, but I mean, does a product like yours tend to cost $1 per month, $100,000 per month, $1 million per month? Like if somebody's listening and saying like, hey, is this in my budget? Roughly. I mean, what does a product generally cost?
So outside of any specific enterprise deals that are going to be negotiated separately, whether it has a level of SLA or whatever it might be, if you look, there is a very standard-based way of doing business with us. We're priding ourselves on being an easy company to transact with. So if you go to our pricing page up on hyperproof.io, there's there's a professional SKU, which is the lower SKU, and then there's a business SKU. They're both denominated on to per program cost, $800 a month per program on the professional SKU. So that's $9,600 a year for a program for SOC or for IC. And then $1,600 a month for the business. The business has a whole raft of customization. You can customize your schema. You can customize health calculations. We provide single sign-on to Okta. That's where the custom integrations that we talked about sit. So we go through and we're very, very open. We're like, hey, here's the capabilities. Do you need them? If we're doing a POC, oftentimes it comes out in the POC as to whether they need it. And then for the largest organizations, we'll negotiate, an enterprise deal.
Gotcha.
Quite straightforward.
Yeah. So I mean, $20K a year when you look at it, as being, when you look at what a security resource costs now, right?
Oh,
I mean, if you look at, especially if you're talking about, someone in San Francisco or something like that, or Boston. But I mean, you're looking at $150,000, $200,000, but I mean, generally speaking, if you look broadly and you said a security resource costs $120,000, that's really 1/6 of an FTE, which basically just means it's just got to provide a little bit of automation capacity, right? Save someone a little bit of time, and it largely can pay for itself pretty quick, it sounds like.
That's how we think about it. We actually say, if you look at the per program price, it probably equates to, depending upon the math, 80, 90, 100 hours of time savings through the year for the whole program. And what we see in customers, they'll tell us, hey, we're saving 10, 15, 20 hours on a program a week of what we used to do. So we think the value is there. Yeah. And we also are disrupting a bit on price. Some of the ones that are the more like established or older guard players are phenomenally expensive.
No, you can listen. I mean, some of the GRC solutions out there, it's easy to spend $120,000 a year, $150,000 a year on.
Right.
So yeah, we've seen it. The other thing too is that what is the value? Like, so especially with SOC 2, right? What is the value of a clean SOC 2 report versus a non-clean SOC 2 report?
That's a really good question, because the thing is, of course, even as a vendor, we get asked for our SOC all the time. Yeah. When you could send a report that has no findings in it, it's amazing.
Completely different. Right? It's completely different. Yeah, it's a completely, like we look at, like we do a lot of third-party risk management, right? We do vendor due diligence. We'll send the questionnaires, we review the reports. And you get to, all right, well, one exception noted, that's not a big exception. You get to the second exception noted and you're like, And when somebody says to you at that point, like, what'd you think? Well, there were a couple of issues on there, like, one you might not mention, but it gets to two and you're like, flags are going off. So that's the other side of the equation, is that, you're in this business, and even just the level of effort that is necessary to prep for an audit. If you're undergoing 2, 3, 4, 5 reviews a year, there's going to be a lot of monetary value proposition there, just in the time savings there as well.
Yeah, the efficiency and the risk reduction is really where it's at, and they're both significant.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Anything else you wanted to chat about before we say fare thee well?
I think you hit all the major issues. The one issue that maybe I would throw out there that's kind of an interesting one, just to mention, and could be a good topic for a follow-up discussion, is around the transparency of what you're doing to your stakeholders. I think that's something that's a little bit underexplored right now in this industry, and I think we want to explore a little bit more. And I'll give you an example in a different part of the industry. You look at it, forget security for a minute. Look at outages. Used to be the case 5 years ago, 7 years ago. If a company had an outage, you might read about it in a news article, but they're not publishing it. They're not telling you that. Now you've got,
Now they're tweeting it. Now they're tweeting it, or you go to, what is it, outage.com. Like YouTube. Yeah, YouTube was a week ago. The YouTube outage.
Yeah.
I mean, I literally happened to sit down and click on a YouTube, and I'm like, what the heck? And I'm like, I wonder if YouTube's having a problem. I typed in YouTube outage, and there's 9 tweets, from different industry people, from Google themselves. At this point, as of this moment, this is what's going on. And then you went down to, and then there's the outage.com, and you can see if it's cascading.
It's critical because people have realized that perfection isn't expected, but you have to be transparent in order to keep on gaining that trust. So the question I'm raising here for us is, how do you do that around compliance and security? How do you do it? And also what we feel is that if you're using a structured, tool with a methodology, something you can be proud of, right? Then you don't mind sharing a little bit more and say, hey, here's how we're managing it. Yeah, we hit a hiccup here, but here's how we manage it. So I think that's an important thing that we're going to explore, and I think the industry should explore, and maybe a good fodder for future discussion.
Yeah, I do think that's a really interesting topic, and there's 2 thoughts that come to mind. One, we have to be careful that we don't end up getting spanked by it. Like, we've got to educate SOC 2 auditors, right? So, like, one of the advantages of not using your tool, is that I can pick and choose the evidence that I present. Where if I've got continuous compliance, the evidence is the evidence. So, you end up in a situation where if I'm being transparent and something was supposed to happen 100 times and it didn't happen once, is that guy going to spank me for that? Right? Or is that guy going to look at that and go like, wow, you're giving me such insane visibility. You didn't give me 1-2 samples that you gave me 100 samples, and there was just one that had a little bit of an issue, and you corrected it at some point in time, and you knew about it instantly. Yeah. So that's the one part of it. The second part of it is really, I think where someone listening that's at a board level or in a management position, I mean, they're going to be the ones that should be demanding that level of transparency. Right, you're increasingly paying your security team, your compliance team, lots of money. Their failure is a business failure now. It's no longer information security risk and business risk. Information security risk is one of your biggest business risks. And if you fail to recognize that, shame on you. So the nice thing is that if you think about it, that should be who should be driving this continuous transparency, because they're the stakeholder, right? They're the ones that you're going to be the one that's standing up there, in front of, on. Kramer or one of these shows saying like, oh, well, here's what happened, and we're really sorry, and mea culpa.
Well, exactly. And I think the thing is, there's really symmetry right now in what a security professional, even up to the CISO or a head of compliance, represents to the board and other stakeholders, and what they feel. They're still pretty nervous about it. And so to the degree you have the transparency and you put the tooling and the automation in, you actually end up in a case where those compliance folks and the CISOs can actually say, I genuinely do feel more confident. I'm not just representing it.
So have you looked at any of the stuff that comes out of, and I'm going to screw up the acronym because it's not a place I normally am, but is it NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, or something like that? So they put out guidance. It was like S630. I can't remember the name of the guidance, but they put out guidance a couple of years ago that basically said that boards can no longer not have sufficient security expertise on the board, to effectively meet their fiduciary responsibilities. And I know
discussions with AICPA. Is that from AICPA or
from no. From there's an entity called the Nationalist. Look, now I'm going to be. I don't know if this is good protocol during a podcast to be actually doing to be Googling. Actually, I'm binging, by the way. Well, I've been using Edge, which I actually kind of like. National Association of Corporate Directors.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm reasonably sure that they put out some guidance, and you'll find a blog I wrote on it a long time ago on our website if you can't find it. I think it was 636 or something like that. I would think that is a really interesting, they should be the ones that are demanding this level of transparency. And
Yeah.
that would, and they take risk to have that job. To some extent, that's their logical way of managing that risk, because no one runs a perfect security program, right? It doesn't exist. So that gives them that ability to, gauge how perfect or imperfect that security program is. And if you don't know how perfect or imperfect your security program is, how could you ever improve it?
That's one of the key things we're looking at too, is, we have a lot of dashboards of the product. We want to formalize it to more of a reporting type of structure, so you can get that information over to the board, because you really want the transparency up and down the chain. So it's really important. I'm gonna check that out. Thanks for the pointer there, John.
Yeah, you sold me. Can I get 3, and do they come in red?
We'll put a big bow around it too.
Because I want it to match the couch and James's jacket when he brings me my tea.
John, we would love to partner with you guys. I mean, I could just tell from the conversation. I mean, the level of sophistication is just great there, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Yeah, well, we should have. Look, we'll have additional conversation, because I mean, I think I think the idea that you have is a good one, and I think if you can find ways of doing that at a reasonable price point with a reasonable level of investment of time, energy, and effort, that the payoff could potentially be really significant. So cool stuff. I very much enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
So I'm not letting you off the hook that easy. So did you do your homework?
I did my homework.
You know what? Because Jeremy warned you that I actually have more fun when people don't do their homework than they do.
I don't
All right, it's gonna be
roasted.
You better step up, then it better be good, because otherwise I'm going to be disappointed. So as we always ask, give me a fictional character or a real world person that you think would make either an amazing or horrible chief information security officer or chief compliance director, and why.
All right, I'm going to give you a real person. He was a general, then he became the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, World War II. And he was presiding over when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. Okay. And of course, there's been a lot of military, incursions and big defeats over the course of you can read all about hundreds of them. But why am I choosing this one? Well, there were 2 things when they actually did an inquiry and kind of looked into how did this happen? The failure of intelligence. The 2 things. He didn't send, and by the way, he did amazing things before and after. He got some amazing, I think, got some amazing prizes and recognition later in the late 40s. But when it came to Pearl Harbor, failure to send the intelligence they had. So big problem for a CISO is, it goes to this whole confidence in what you represent versus what you really think. When you find an issue, and it goes to the transparency we're talking about, when you find an issue, bad news doesn't get better with age, right? You have to send that out, and you've got to get people working on it. You can't just try to contain it to a crazy degree, because it thwarts your ability to react. That's one thing that came out of the inquiry. The second thing that came out is some people say, did we not know that, let's say that in that case, Japan might attack us at Pearl Harbor or in Hawaii more generally? It's clear that everybody had considered that as a possibility. So that part of it wasn't a surprise. The biggest surprise was that we weren't well prepared for it. We actually thought we were better prepared. So the CISO has to know the true preparedness state of the organization. So sharing that information and knowing the preparedness state is what made George Marshall a bad candidate for a CISO, but it's something everybody should focus on now going forward.
So just to be clear, he did a bad job.
He did a bad job because he didn't send the intelligence, he didn't share it fast enough, and he didn't understand that Hawaii wasn't ready for the attack. They thought the attack could happen. They were surprised how we weren't ready at Pearl Harbor afterwards, right? And so you can't be surprised if of course, as a CISO, attackers are coming in all the time. Right. You can't be surprised with your stance. Your stance has to be there. Yeah,
so that's that danger, and God bless, we see it everywhere. Is that that false sense of security that way too many organizations have. Exactly. Like I can't even count the number of times I'm chatting with somebody, and they're a pretty successful organization, and they're like, no, you don't understand, we're not big enough that
Right. It's the asymmetry between they drink their own Kool-Aid. They're telling the board everything's great, but you actually really have to be prepared, for
and the problem is that they think they're great, but they just don't know. So yeah, that was actually a really good answer. Dang it, you got me.
You can get me on something else next time.
You got me. All right, so I'm not going to ask you about another podcast. I think the transparency one is an interesting topic for another episode. Maybe we'll get together and just talk about transparency and what that would look like, and and really who should be, who should be driving it? How would you structure it? Because I think that's a really interesting topic.
I can see a small panel with some people from some different perspectives in there. I'd love to talk to you about it, John.
Yeah, that sounds cool. All right, so last thing, as we say, our fairly wells. How can folks get in contact with yourself, HyperProof? If they're intrigued by what you guys are doing.
You can catch us, of course, at our site, hyperproof.io. There's a million ways from Sunday to connect with us there and get demos and things like that. You can find me as Craig Unger on LinkedIn, CEO of HyperProof. You can also email me at craig@hyperproof.io. And then, of course, we have a Twitter and a Facebook. You can find us at kind of hashtag HyperProof and on Twitter and Facebook as well.
Cool beans. Well, listen, it was genuinely a lot of fun to have a chat. You actually. You got me excited. I'm like, now I'm going to spend, I'm going out to dinner tonight. I'm going to have my martini and I'm going to be thinking about this continuous compliance and transparency. And
it's my pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, same here, man. So listen, have a great weekend. All right. And we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, we'll catch you soon, John. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye now.